This podcast is brought to you by Reimagine Radio, the online radio station that aims to give you information on disability and music. My name's Graham Wyman, and welcome to Reimagine Radio. Today I'm joined by Stanley. She has her MFA from UBC, and she's been published in Fugue, Hit Mama, Paste, as well as contributing to VAMS clients Simon Paradise's records Good Road Home, Mouthful of Stars, and Grooves and Ruts. Welcome, Kara. How you doing today?
Hi, Graham. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. It's Friday. Well, it'll be Wednesday when this comes out, but yeah, no, beautiful day out. Looking forward to the weekend.
Yeah, it's going to be gorgeous today.
Yeah, exactly. So, why don't we dive in?
Okay.
So, I read your interview at the CBC that if you weren't an author, you would be interested in pursuing a career in neuropsychology. What was it about that intrigued you, and how does your experience in classical Pilates help this?
It's such a great question. So I think writing and psychology are intrinsically linked. In many ways, I think it's a very similar job description. Writers, of all different genres, essays, nonfiction, fiction, I think they're really engaged in exploring the human condition, human psychology, and they're exploring it through language and story. Mm-hmm. And I think psychologists are doing similar work on a one-on-one basis with their clients. Probably if CBC had asked that question before I wrote Fallen, I would have just said psychology. Mm-hmm. But the research I did into neuroplasticity when I was writing Fallen, I became really fascinated with all things about the brain, mm-hmm. And in particular its capacity for healing and resiliency and change throughout the lifespan. Mm-hmm. And I love that you ask about the Pilates, because I don't think a lot of people would necessarily see that connection, mm-hmm. But it is absolutely connected for me. Mm-hmm. For me, Pilates, it's a healthy thing to do, but really at its core, it's a method for strengthening mind-body communication. Mm-hmm. And it does that through emphasizing its emphasis on coordinating breath with movement, and that can be very simple movement or it can be very complex movement. Right. And I think the movement community, all different kind of movement practitioners like Feldenkrais and Alexander, yoga practitioners, Pilates teachers, dancers. I think for a long time, there's been this very embodied awareness that there is a constant bi-directional conversation going on between our physiological states and our psychological story. Right. And science is kind of catching up with that, constantly and articulating it on a biological level. Recently, there's this groundbreaking, work being done on what they call the polyvagal theory. Okay. And it's really looking at the biology of that mind-body connection, how our physiological states influence the psychological stories we're telling, right. And understanding in the world. So, to me, the Pilates really enhances my writing. And the other thing that the Pilates does, I don't teach a lot right now. I teach a very, very minimal amount. But what's really nice about it is writing is often very lonely. You do it by yourself. You don't get a lot of feedback. Mm-hmm. And so I have a handful of clients, Pilates clients that I see and have seen for many, many years. And it's just, it's at this point, it's almost as much for me as it is for them. Okay. I get this one-on-one connection with them. I spend an hour with them. I can influence the ease with which they're moving, and I get immediate feedback. Mm-hmm. Whereas with writing, it can be years before you get any feedback.
No, of course, no. It's instant gratification almost to a certain degree.
Yeah. And then the other thing is too, as a writer, when you're young, it was hard to sit down long enough to get any work done. And then as you get older, it gets harder to get back up and moving again.
Right. So it's the inverse.
For me, the Pilates and the writing is also you never find that perfect balance, but it's an attempt to kind of, keep moving, keep writing, and keep it all in a little bit of balance.
Can't have that yin without that yang.
Yeah, exactly. It's a dynamic situation.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So, obviously, you and Simon are very passionate and connected to music. How did that develop when you guys first met, and how has it evolved as your relationship has evolved?
Right. Well, I was 14 when I met Simon. Mm-hmm. So, at that time, I had been a dancer, a little ballet kid. So, my connection to music was really through movement and rhythm, a lot of classical music more than other stuff. And in terms of my knowledge of pop music, it was, totally status quo. It was like whatever was on the radio. Yeah. Like a lot of, a little ditty about Jack and Diane, or, Phil Collins and the night, that kind of stuff. But when I met Simon, he had access to his father's very deep, broad, expansive musical library. Mm-hmm. And so it was a huge education for me. And, it was listening to, all sorts of different artists, all sorts of different genres. Simon has this, very wide, expansive view of music, and he loves it all. Yeah. So, his passion for all different kinds of music really informed me. And, I really started listening to Dylan or, some of the older jazz artists or, everything. It was everything that wasn't on the radio, everything that was really good and awesome. I learned through Simon's dad's record collection.
You basically got a master's in music.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course Simon went on to study music at Concordia, and so I was always on the outside of that in a way. He was busy doing his thing, I was doing mine, but I benefited from just Simon's musical intelligence and, hanging out with really gifted musicians and hearing how they thought and looked at the world and then just spending my weekends listening to really great music, all of that. I had been, writing songs, but at that time, before Si's accident, he was much more of side guy. I guess maybe that sounds not quite right, but he was an improviser. He was an instrumentalist more than he was the singer-songwriter he's become since his accident. And he wasn't, I didn't have the skills to take the words I was writing and put it into music, and Simon was busy doing other things and working on projects. And so in the aftermath of his accident, when he kind of had to just everything, reimagine his relationship with music, with his instrument. He had to radically slow down, and that was, obviously for many obvious reasons, that was really difficult. But it also did create the opportunity that he and I could start collaborating. I had a handful of lyrics. I think a lot of people assume they were written after Simon's accidents because they have a certain resonance after his accident, but most of them were written prior, and they were just sitting in a stack, and we had never gotten around to actually writing the music for it. So that was just really cool, as somebody who doesn't have a lot of musical skills, to be involved in that creative process. It's just really thrilling. And it was really important for Simon and I in the aftermath of his accident, because it gave us a way to, some of the songs were sort of direct reflections after his accident. So it gives us a way to talk about it, workshop it, process it, and transform it, transform it so it's not just pain or grief, loss, change that you have no control over, it gives you a little bit of control over that transformative process. We get to decide what we're turning into.
Of course. Yeah.
And for us, writing songs, collaborating on that was a huge part of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you touched on something that I would like to touch back on. Outside of Fallen, how has, say, Simon's musical journey impacted, or has it impacted your writing? And again, outside of Fallen, and even before Si's accident, or has it?
It'd be really hard to say. I mean, just Simon's musical person has impacted, we've been together, now for more than half of our lives. So, I mean, if you know Simon, he's kind of like music through and through, and we sort of raised each other. We had a kid at 21, right. And so everything I am today is completely influenced and impacted by Simon, and because Simon is music. But I probably couldn't even tease that apart. But one of the things that's very concrete is that my first book, which was actually published after Fallen, and it came out under the title Ghost Warning. Yeah. For many, many years, I worked on it, and I know you have a question about it later on, so I won't go into it too much, but
no worries.
The working title was Gut Bucket Thunder.
Okay.
And it was a musical phrase probably that Simon had said to me, and it captured my imagination, and I love the prosody of the language, like it just sort of trips off the tongue. And so the book was Gut Bucket Thunder, and I was writing it. I was struggling to write it, and while I was doing that, Simon got a trio together, and they loved the name, and they wanted to use it. And they asked me if they could use it, and it was the name of my thesis while I was at UBC. And I had a moment. I was like, I don't know. Okay, should I give it away? But the problem was that as a name, it much more suited the trio than it did the book.
Okay,
it actually wasn't working as the title for the book, but right. I was sort of trying to muscle
hold on to it. Yeah. And
then I was like, no, it works better for the trio. They were so Gut Bucket Thunder. It was a name for them, and right. So, and then what was really the interesting thing about it, the name Ghost Warning. Actually, another friend of ours who's a poet and musician, he had an album coming out, and one of the titles for the CD was Ghost Warning, and they went with something different, but I asked him, but it worked with the story. And so that book, it sort of gave a band a name, and it received a name from a band. So I know.
The wheel came full circle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There you go. So, speaking on Fallen, your first published book, even though it wasn't the first one that you had technically written, and again, the name is Fallen, A Trauma, a Marriage, and the Transformative Power of Music, takes the reader through the aftermath of a life-threatening brain and spinal cord injury of Simon. Can you tell our listeners maybe a bit about how you decided to come about writing the book? And,
So, as you mentioned, just before Simon's accident, I had just finished up my graduate work. So I had been working on this Gut Bucket Thunder / Ghost Warning thesis for a long time, and it wasn't quite right. But I had been writing, and then Simon's accident happened, and it was, just our whole life took a complete left turn. And in the early days, and they were really scary and really uncertain days, we didn't know if Simon would recover. It seemed unlikely at first, and if he did recover, how much of a recovery he would make. And so for me, as a person who writes, I started writing all the time, but it was journaling, right? And it was with no intention of writing a book. It was just because that was my primary coping skill. It was, I think a lot of writers feel that they don't really know what they're thinking or feeling, or until they write it down. That actually the act of writing something is part of the process of understanding what we're moving through. And so for me, that was my go-to coping skill. And the journals sort of mostly took the form of an open letter to Simon. As my best friend, at that time we had been together for, I don't know, 18 years, close to, best friends since we were 14. So say more than 20 years.
Of course.
And all of a sudden I'm going through the most stressful experience of my life, and he's not there to talk to. And so that's really what the journals were. They were an open letter to Simon, in the way that we would talk on a daily basis. And then there were phases. He moved into rehab, and I think a couple of things happened there. For me, it was the first experience, like up close experience of the human capacity to survive and to a certain extent heal really profound wounds, really profound injuries. And I think Simon went through a huge transformative process in rehab. There was a lot happening, but it was also, for me, I don't think you can move through something and not be impacted and changed,
of course,
and moved by it. And on my side, trying to do what I could, I was doing all sorts of research into neuroplasticity. That's when I started that inquiry. So I had, on one hand, I had my personal journals, and then I also had a folder of research that was building. And in the first few years after we got home, again, our very busy lives, we were in our 30s, we had a young son, we had really busy lives. And then all of a sudden it wasn't busy. Simon was needing to sleep a lot. I was at home. And so the book started coming together that way. And even before I realized it was a book, it was all a part of understanding what I could do to help him in healing, understanding what had happened, understanding how I was feeling, all of that. It was really a very intense process of trying to understand what was happening. I had a writing partner from my time at UBC, Rachel Rose. She's no longer doing it now, but she was for some time the poet laureate in Vancouver. She's an incredibly talented writer, and we have like a weekly, sometimes we're workshopping work and sometimes we're just sort of like cheerleading and support or like rant, whatever. But we have a weekly writing conversation, and it was through those conversations that she started saying, you have a book, you have a story that you could tell. And then of course the next step was sitting down with Simon and saying, how do you feel if I write this? And he was really enthusiastic. He had one caveat that I not sort of gloss over some of the more difficult aspects of spinal cord injury, the things that he wanted open and frank discussions about as he was going through rehab, things about bowel and bladder care, some of the things that were, it's not sort of civil conversation necessarily. And he was like, I don't want a book that just sort of whitewashes over that. And so
the realness of the experience you wanted to.
He didn't want me to sugarcoat it. So that was liberating in a lot of ways, that he was going to read everything as I went through. So then I had to ask my son if it was okay. He was 16, 17 at the time. And so I said, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? Can I do it? Is it too much exposure? Can I tell this story that is not just my story, but it's Simon's story and it's our story as a family? And it was really funny. He was like, I think it's a great idea, but how does it end? So there was a point in the writing where the writing caught up to real life, and I had to take a break. And the writing process, the publishing process is slow. So the book was accepted by a publisher and really the final third wasn't written. There was sort of a stand-in ending,
right,
and it was a little too pat. I wasn't happy with it, but it was like we needed a little more real life to be able to write the ending.
Yeah.
And so that's how it happened. I think a lot of people who aren't writers often ask me, when they heard I was writing the book, they were like, it must be really therapeutic. And it really wasn't. It was really like during the writing of it, I think as writers, the writing of a book is different than the journaling experience, which was therapeutic in a lot of ways. But writing a book, you have to kind of relive those difficult moments over and over again, and make it sufficiently vivid that it's going to be compelling for a reader, and that it's kind of re-traumatizing mostly, so that and there was also the sense of all this focus that I'm doing on writing the book. Should that focus maybe rather be on rebuilding our lives and things out in the world? Because you do kind of have to turn away from the world a little bit. And that was a constant dialogue I had writing the book. But I think in retrospect, years after the book's been published, I can look back and see sort of the whole process. So the journaling, the research, the writing the first draft, the doing the editing, the publishing it, and part of that is letting go of a story, and moving on, and then traveling around to promote it and talking with people across the country. That whole process was really therapeutic, and I think it was therapeutic in the sense that when something like that happens, you have to learn how to grieve, and you have to learn how to carry that grief forward in your life, without it becoming like a constant shroud or veil of tears. Like you have to kind of, how do I carry this grief forward and still make my best attempt at living a joyful and productive life?
Own it to a certain degree.
Yeah, and so for me, that writing the book was a big part of it. For Simon, it's always been about music, and again, our collaboration, it was a big part of that. So I think that's it. Yeah, so the whole process maybe was therapeutic. Some of the day-to-day writing is I don't think people understand that it's not just sort of emotionally and psychically hard, but it's physically hard, because it's like,
well, you have to be so objective on what you're putting out to.
Yeah, or you're imagining it so intensely. You're sitting in your chair, but you often your body is sort of going through the same sort of traumatic things that happen when you're in the midst of the trauma. So it can be also physically hard. The writing of it. I think it's something I don't think I totally understood until I went through the process of how you have to sort of also protect your emotional health, but also your physical body.
Of course, yeah. So you mentioned Simon's rehabilitation. I mean, this might be a little difficult, but was there a time when you felt, or a specific point where his recovery was showing, significant progress?
Well, certainly, like the time in rehab, he made huge leaps and bounds. In 3 months, there was a really accelerated progress, and then of course that progress plateaus. But I think I would say I don't know after he got out of rehab that I've ever noticed like a huge jump.
Gotcha.
It's more the kind of
daily,
incremental, invisible ways that the healing happens. But I do, there has been, I mean, you're seeing 7 years, is that maybe that's a quote from the book?
Yeah.
7, yeah, so now we're 12 years, and I would say it still continues. And a huge part of that is music. And I think, with the brain injury, like many people who've suffered a head injury, sometimes there's this sort of constellation of sort of poorly defined abstract things that, medically there's not sort of a concrete way to treat it, but leaves a person feeling like they're just not, it's just not quite right. And I think Simon was there for a while, and music again was his way to work through it. So things like, his ability to initiate and plan and focus and multitask and memory, all of those things have constantly improved. His stamina, and that's all happened through the vehicle of music. And in particular, one of the areas where he most felt his brain injury was in improvising, when he and that had been a particular skill prior to his accident. But he would say, like, he'll say it was like, he was trying to think through oatmeal or something, like it just, he couldn't quite, it's such a juggling act. You're having to listen to other musicians, you're having to make rational and emotional choices, you're trying to create a story with your solo. Then there's just all the actual motor skills involved in it. There's a lot of things happening, and for him, that's where he felt that he could get halfway through a solo, and then he'd say it's like I was just falling down the stairs, Yeah. So he went through Berklee School of Music. He did the online program. I know you guys, you were there in person, but but he did that, and he took individual courses to focus on improvising. So just breaking it down, slowing it down, really bringing awareness to the whole process until gradually he could speed it up to the speed that he wanted to be improvising at. So that was a really fascinating thing to watch, and it helped all of these other areas, I think. And it's not, I don't have MRI scans or those kinds of things, but, definitely all of those things that I had no idea how to help him with, that I think are very abstract. He was able to help himself through being a musician. Yeah.
No, of course. No, I remember speaking with Simon, just again, him telling me how the process that he had to go through, basically relearning the instrument again.
Yeah.
And how competent he was before the accident, right?
Yeah.
So no. Yeah. And to see him today too is like, yesterday he sent me something for our collaboration song, and it's just, he knows my tendencies too and what I like to hear. So it's funny. He's like, I threw in a David Gilmour lick in there for you. So I was like, yeah. So no. Yeah. It's fantastic.
One of the things I thought was so interesting, that like he had always been an electric guitar player. That was his instrument.
Right.
But then coming out of rehab, his impulse, what he decided to do was take classical music lessons. Like he wanted to do something kind of completely different. So he wasn't referencing his pre-accident self, but just something to start to tone his skills again. But like I was like, he didn't want a reference to where he had been at before. So it was just back on his instrument, but it was an acoustic classical guitar, and just coming at it from a different angle, which I thought was both really interesting and a really wise choice. And eventually he's come back and he's playing his instrument, but I thought it was sort of, I thought it was really bold and cool and and really wise, because he was able to sort of find his own way back, but without having to constantly make comparisons to who the player he was before.
No, reinvent himself.
He really did that. He really set out to kind of reinvent his relationship, and again, part of that was the songwriting, which was awesome for me, because it was really thrilling to kind of be in the music process in a way that I never had been before.
No, of course. Well, speaking of the songwriting, as we mentioned earlier, you were a contributing songwriter on Stanton Paradise's Good Road Home and Simon's first solo record, A Mouthful of Stars, in 2015, and then Grooves and Ruts, which came out last year. Last year. So, How did you contribute to both records, and how does participating in the songwriting differ from when you're writing a novel?
Well, with the songwriting, well, it's different from a book process in a lot of ways. I mean, it's much shorter. It's much more collaborative. It's much more engaged. It's really fun. Books, I tend to work slowly. I mean, planning a book, you kind of, when I set down to do it, I'm sort of thinking it's a 2 or 3 year commitment at the short. I mean, I know there's some authors who put out books every year. I am not one of those authors. And so it can be kind of lonely, you have to withdraw from a lot of your regular social engagement. But the big thing for me with the songwriting is really that it's a place for me where it's just kind of pure creative play. And that's really only possible because Simon takes like 99% of the responsibility of making the actual song happen.
Right.
He gives me co-credit on the songwriting. We do it in different ways. Sometimes there's lyrics where I've written an entire song and then he puts it to music. Sometimes he has a musical phrase and he'll sort of mumble out syllables and I'll write words to it. Or sometimes he'll start some lyrics and I'll jump in and fine tune it. Or those are the most fun, I think, where he maybe has a musical phrase or sometimes he'll have a lyric idea. And then I'll write a bunch and he'll chop it in half and then I'll add some more to that. It is sort of a back and forth, and those are also really fun. But but it's not, he does all of the music making, the arranging, the performing it live, the recording it, like all of that. I mean, that's just, I don't have the skills to be able to do that. Bottom line, like I couldn't manifest that. So I get a little tiny part of the process and I have a lot of fun with it. And Simon, of course, loves the process. And if you know him, he's a person who always has fun with it as well. But it's also work. And you're also, he's much more on the front lines of putting himself out there and making himself vulnerable as a songwriter. And I think also with me, I think music is also maybe unique in the sense that people sort of think you have musical talent or you don't. Like you have blue eyes or you have brown eyes, but in my experience, the musicians I've known, I mean, these are people who work really, really hard at maintaining those skills and keeping them sharp throughout their life. And it's really an amazing thing because we're a really material-based culture. We're materially motivated. And for most musicians, that's not work that's generally recognized or recompensed. Like you're not there's no way as a musician or really a writer that you're making an hourly wage that is reasonable. It's a really unreasonable proposition for most people, I think. I mean, there's this select few that make it big, but the musicians I know work really hard for decades, 50, passion, 60 years. They're constantly working to keep those skills sharp. So I get to sort of, I'm like a little barnacle in the process. I get to just sort of like go along for the fun ride and like, then get to go to the bar and have a glass of wine and dance to the song that I've had a little bit of influence on. But it's a pretty small part of it, I think.
I mean, I've seen the way you guys kind of, even when we were recording the record, that Mouthful of Stars, I'd say you were pretty integral in that part.
That's awesome. I mean, I think that's been the real joy of recording at the house and recording with kind of the really nice, awesome group of musicians Simon's now. I mean, they're all awesome, but Mouthful of Stars and Grooves and Ruts, it's really kind of a great ensemble of people. And I think I felt more and more comfortable just, you know, I have non-musical language, you know, but people have been really great at sort of extending themselves to sort of hear what I'm saying, and you know, metaphoric, or you know, I tend to think more rhythmically, and I can much more easily imagine sort of a rhythm I hear with the words than I can like a melody or something like that.
Yeah.
But and then Simon's been coming. We sing songs together in the evening, and like I'm getting to the point where like maybe if we have people over, I'll sing on the porch.
Nice.
Maybe
there we go. Debut.
You know, I don't have big ambitions musically, but that, you know, that would be like if we have a dinner party and we sing a few songs afterwards, like not to be so scared that I'm gonna sing way out of tune that I don't sing. Like just who cares if I'm out of tune? I'll just sing along.
Exactly. So, go for it.
Those are like my big ambitions.
Oh, there we go. That's fantastic. We'll have to get you guys out for a show when all this is said and done. Yeah. So, speaking of these records, is there a particular one that you would like our listeners to hear as we end part 1 of this conversation?
You mean a particular song?
Yeah, off these 3 records.
Yeah, I think probably on any record.
Yeah,
yeah. I like I wrote Nothing Nothing on Grooves and Ruts, and that's one of the ones where I wrote the lyrics, and it was, I wanted to write something fun. You know, there had been a lot of kind of heavy songs, and so that one I really like. The 2 on Mouthful of Stars.